All right. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on rhetoric and persuasion. Um, and we'll look at a few different examples. We'll look at some of those examples in text. We'll start with looking at some of those examples in videos, right? This is one of these things that is a skill set that we already do, right? Like there's constantly situations where we're using rhetorical strategies to persuade our readers, right? And or our listeners, right? And it's also one of those things that is constantly around us, right? Whether it's a commercial that we're looking at, whether it's a campaign ad that we're being asked to vote a certain way, if it's trying to maybe make somebody feel comforted or make somebody feel better, or persuade someone to get you something, right? Like it's one of these strategies that is just ubiquitous, meaning it's everywhere. We're constantly being exposed to rhetoric. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And we'll talk a little bit about like how we're able to do that. And I think that like, as we think about effective communication, it's one of those instances where as we become more aware of it and as we become more skilled at kind of using that practice, you can make arguments incredibly effective, right? And kind of going back to my point about like rhetoric is one of those things that we use super early on, right? Like whether or not we're aware of it, I think it just kind of goes into the ways that that's how we build arguments, right? Like even from the time that they were really young, like my kids were able to use rhetorical strategies as a means of trying to get the things that they wanted, right? So like, for example, yesterday my son had to get like a booster shot for an immunization. And so like, as we were getting ready to go, when it was on the way to Kaiser, he's like, I'm really scared about getting my shot. And I'm like, oh, it's not scary. You're going to be all right. I'm really nervous. And I was like, I know, bud, but I'm going to be a big boy. And I'm like, yeah, you're going to be a big boy, bud. Can we get McDonald's after we're done? Right. And it's like before he asked that question of if we could stop at McDonald's on the way home, he already kind of laid the framework about I'm going to get a shot, but I'm going to be a big boy and I'm going to try not to cry. Right. I mean, he's already kind of establishing before he asks the question that he deserves to go to McDonald's after it's over, right? And so I think this is one of those like simple examples, but an example of where we see rhetorical strategies get used and where they're constantly around us, and it's constantly kind of the way that we build arguments. And as we become more aware of those things, then we can think about different ways that we can utilize these skills. So I'm going to show you like some different examples and kind of talk through a little bit about what it is and how we use it. So here's this first. Let me just blow this up really quick. Okay, so a little bit about the background of what rhetoric is, right? So if we think about rhetoric just as a simple definition, rhetoric is the art of persuading through effective and purposeful speaking and writing, right? So what that means is like when I say purposeful language, if I go back to the example that my son gave about talking about the question he has of if we could stop at McDonald's on the way home from Kaiser, on purpose he talked about the fact that he had to get the shot first. He didn't just start with can we go to McDonald's, right? He kind of started with this, here's the things that he wants to say on purpose beforehand before he asks the question, right? So when we think about what rhetoric is thinking about your goal is to persuade your audience, right? Your goal is to persuade, whether you're writing, whether you're speaking to somebody, right? Is it an email? And think about, there's constantly times when we do that, right? Like if we're writing an email to somebody, if we're asking somebody a question, if we're making a post on Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is that we do, like there's all those times that we ask ourselves, am I saying this the right way? Am I being effective in the way that I say this? Sometimes my wife will have to write like an email for work, and maybe it goes out to like, some management within the hospital that she works at. And there's times when she'll ask me, am I saying this the right way? Am I coming off too aggressive? Am I coming off open enough? Does it sound friendly enough, right? And so like those kind of questions about like some of the emotion that we're putting out there, the way that we're saying things, that's rhetoric. If we think about maybe there's a time where you have to have a difficult conversation with a friend or a family member, right? And you want to make sure that you say something the right way. Sometimes we even practice a little bit, like here's how I would say this. Here's the wording that I'm going to choose to use, right? And the reason that we're doing that is because we're choosing our language, we're choosing our wording on purpose. And if we think about the purpose behind why we choose that language, the purpose is there because we want to be able to help persuade somebody, right? To guide somebody in a specific direction. So that's really an easy way to think about what rhetoric is think about it as like we're using language on purpose, right? That our wording is intentional, our phrasing is intentional, that there's not this idea of like we're just kind of saying whatever comes to mind. That a lot of times when you're listening to people, especially in context of speeches, right? In context of like we're going to look at some political ads, things like that, like nothing that's being presented to you is accidental, right? It's being done with extreme intention. Oop. All right, so rhetoric kind of has this history of looking back at. Excellent, my mouse is being weird. Sorry, I skipped one. So let's talk about why we should study rhetoric, like, or why we should be aware of what rhetoric is. A big reason of why you want to think about studying rhetoric is you're able to magnify your influence, right? You're able to effectively communicate or effectively argue, and make that stronger, right? By knowing how to utilize rhetoric and by being aware of the different strategies that you have at your disposal. It also really makes you more informed. I think that's one of the things that's really important. And I think that kind of ties into the third point, this idea of like, you can kind of protect yourself in a way. There's a lot of times where you're going to be able to realize, and I'm sure that you already can do that you can realize that you're being exposed to kind of like propaganda, in other words, right? And propaganda is not necessarily like a bad thing or a good thing. It just kind of is what it is, right? And so it's one of these things where like people are utilizing rhetorical strategies, right? They're utilizing these different ways of being able to motivate people as a means to kind of sell somebody on something. And sometimes that can literally be sell something like, I want you to buy this thing, but it also could be like selling an idea. I want you to believe in this idea. I want you to follow along with me on this idea that I'm presenting you, right? And so if we think about it from that context, then there can be some feelings of like you can protect yourself, right? Meaning that you can spot persuasive language when you see it, right? Like what you're trying to do here is you're trying to make me feel a certain way. What you're trying to do here is you're trying to make me question ethics or appeal to an emotion that I have. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And when you can think about this idea of like, if you know that you're kind of being exposed to a rhetorical strategy, then it's an easy way to be able to say, I see what this person is doing here and I see how they're doing it. And I may or may not agree with the idea, but I'm not necessarily going to let that strategy overwhelm me, right? Or maybe a lot of times we think about these ideas and we'll look at some things, we think about like fear. Like fear can be an extremely powerful motivator, right? And I'll talk about that in a minute or two. And if we think about this idea that sometimes we could be watching commercials, right? And I think about like some of these like home security ads, right? And I'm like watching TV at night and I see a commercial come on. And then in the commercial that I'm watching, there's like an ad for whatever, ADT or some sort of like, home alarm or whatever. And when you watch the commercial, like the whole goal of the commercial, it shows like a family's asleep at night, you hear a window break, and all of a sudden like the alarm goes off and police get called and stuff like that. But the whole point of that commercial is to like invoke fear in the reader, right? Invoke fear in the viewer. This idea that if I'm home, I'm thinking about my family, I'm thinking about their safety, and I'm like, oh man, I got to go online and I got to buy, some sort of security system. And so I think that like we always have to kind of be careful that like we're aware that it's coming at us, and that also allows us to become a critical consumer. And sometimes that consumer, again, goes into the idea of sales, and rhetoric is definitely there, but also it has to do with being a critical consumer of information. Meaning that like, to me, I think that's one of the most important things that we take away from English 1, right? Is that like, not only are we critical writers, right? Like that we're able to present our arguments, we're able to build on those arguments that we're presenting and effectively make those arguments to our readers, but that also we're critical consumers of information, right? That we're reading through people's ideas and we're able to, for ourselves, make our decisions of what we believe to be true about these ideas. And maybe a lot of you have done that or are doing that now, right? Like with voting, like I know that like kind of going through and like reading up on the different propositions, like there's a lot of things that I don't know about. And so I have to kind of like read through multiple articles, right? Like for example, there's certain propositions like the one about, contracted or independent drivers, and thinking about like companies like Uber and Postmates and things like that. And I was like, I really don't know enough about this, so I need to inform myself about it. But I'm not going to read from just one source, right? Because we know if I go to something that's in favor of that proposition, then I'm going to be seeing an argument that only that wants me to understand. If I go to something that's against that proposition, then I'm only going to be seeing that side of the argument. And part of being a critical consumer is knowing that like I have to read things from different angles, right? I have to be open to all these different ideas. And then from there, that forms my opinion. And I think another big thing to think about is this idea of like with language comes power, right? It's kind of like a more boring version of like Spider-Man's with like, great power comes great responsibility. But I think that's really important to think about, that like language is a construct of power, right? Like plain and simple, as far as I'm concerned, that we can motivate people sometimes to do amazing, beautiful things, and sometimes to do horrible things through language, right? Like if we think about in our history, if we think about people who are masters at rhetoric, right? Like some of the names that come to mind, like for example, Martin Luther King Jr., right? Like when you analyze his speeches, and this would be an option if you're thinking about next semester, if a class that's, we'll talk a little bit later about classes that are about what comes after English 1, and there's two options, English 2 and English 4. And this is the kind of stuff that you really dive into in English 4, is looking at authors or writers' purposes, looking at the way they present their ideas, evaluating the quality of their ideas and the strength of their arguments by looking at things like rhetorical strategies, logical fallacies, things like that. And one of the things that you might look at is like, for example, if analyzing Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches, right, that he was able to use incredibly effective language, right, as a platform for being able to fight for civil rights and as a way of creating a revolution or a movement based off of the words that he was using, right? And so there can be examples of rhetoric through history that were used to make massive change. On the other hand, there's also examples of the power that can be created behind language. If we look at the rise of Nazi Germany, for example, Joseph Goebbels was the head of propaganda for Nazi Germany and was able to use language as a way of convincing the majority of a country that moving forward with the genocide was a plan that people should be supporting, right? And so I think that that's one of the things that we have to be aware of, is that like language is extremely powerful, right? That like people can persuade people a lot of times in the same way with words as people can also be persuaded with bullets. And I think that that's one of those things that if we look at some different examples, and like in a class like English 4, like one of the things that I start with when I teach that class is looking at specific quotes that came out of like from Joseph Goebbels, or looking at specific quotes that came out from King, and thinking about some of these ideas about how here are two examples on completely different ends of the spectrum as far as what the purpose was, but here is how language was used as a means of being able to motivate people in that direction. So I think that's really important to think about when we look at rhetoric. Any questions at all so far? We'll look at some examples in a second. So rhetoric, just kind of quickly, like if we think about like historical context, right? Like, so these fellas up here at the top, these were the sophists, right? And if we think about like what was going on in ancient Greece, like this idea of like, these were people who, if you look at their picture, even I love this picture of them because like they're all kind of look like super self-important. Like this guy in the robe, I'm pointing at my picture and you can't see what I'm pointing at, but this guy in the robe in the center is like, looks like he has like a really good idea, right? Like some people are listening to him, some people aren't. And so this idea of like the sophists were kind of like a group of intellectuals that like basically sat around and just like talked about stuff all day long, right? And they kind of like pontificated on different things. And maybe we know some people in our lives who are kind of like this, right? Like I've had some friends or have some friends that would fall under this category of people who just like want to sit around, they have opinions on everything, but like they're just kind of talking bullshit more than anything else, right? And I think that that's the history of where this was, is like, here are these intellectuals that are going to sit around and they're just going to like pontificate on all of these different ideas. Here's my opinion about this, whatever, right? And then along the way then came Aristotle, right? And his ideas was that the sophists, he said that they're misusing rhetoric, right? They're giving this idea of persuasive language a bad name. So he says that like, instead of sitting around and thinking about, let's like kind of talk about all of these different ideas, Aristotle said that what we should be doing instead is thinking about rhetoric as using any means that we have available as a means, as a way to persuade people, right? So that he argues that above all else, logic is what's most important, right? Reason is what's most important. The point that you want to make to your reader, in other words, is what's most important. However, he also recognizes that it's important that sometimes, to be able to get that point that we want to make across, that we can use rhetoric, we can use something that other than language, persuasive language, emotion, things like that, as a way to make that point more effective. So it was, before it was all about kind of like, you know, fast talking and being persuasive. And that was the only reason that the sophists were doing it. Kind of like, I want to flex my intellectual muscle and persuade people. And Aristotle said that's wrong. More importantly than anything else, the message, the idea is what has to be at the forefront. But there are those times where we can use other strategies to help accentuate that idea. So we'll talk a little bit about what his way of creating persuasion was. So that's where he came up with this idea of like the three means that people are persuaded. And so this is like, I posted some information on this also on Canvas, that if you had a chance to look at it, awesome. And if you haven't, then you can go back and look at that. And it breaks down these three means of persuasion. So the first one that Aristotle talks about is this idea of ethos, right? And this is the appeal to ethics. So again, when he's talking about this idea of using rhetoric, different than the way that rhetoric was used by the sophists, as far as like, you know, just trying to win arguments or trying to kind of like intellectually one up somebody, he's saying that you can create an argument, you can present your idea, and then in an effective way of being able to create the increased efficacy of your argument is thinking about how people are appealed to ethics, right? That we're convincing somebody of the credibility or the character of the person who's speaking, or sometimes kind of like trying to weaken the credibility of somebody who is not speaking, right? That you're speaking against. And so if we think about this idea, right, like that sometimes we're constantly trying to do this, where we're trying to say like, here's my character, here's who I am as a person, right? Like that I can create a more effective argument by establishing credibility of, here's the kind of person that I am, right? And that's one of the things that like, you know, I mean, even at the beginning of the semester, right? Like when I introduce myself to people, right? I'm thinking about, and especially that's really hard online, right? Like that's one of the things that I think about when I started teaching online. This semester is my first full semester of teaching online. I think about like, what is my ethos, right? Like, what am I trying to convince you to be true about the person that I am? And how do I do that online? Right? Like when I meet with all of you, if this class was face to face, like we'd have the opportunity, like you would get to know me, in other words, right? Like, but instead, like when I try to create that version of myself online, like in my welcome video and the way that I'm writing, I'm trying to project this idea to you that like I'm friendly, that I'm open, that I'm trying to be supportive, right? That I'm trying to be accommodating. So it's like maybe in one of those instances, we think about this idea of like, we're really trying to convince people about the credibility or about an element of somebody's character when we think about that ethical piece of it, or that ethos. Pathos is the appeal to emotion, right? Like this is really important because people are incredibly motivated by emotion, right? And if we think about this idea of, for example, think about how powerful of a motivator fear is, right? Like if we think about the idea that like we can easily be persuaded, I think, when we're afraid, So one of the examples that I usually give when I'm like face to face in class is like, if we were standing in a classroom and all of a sudden, like I screamed, quick, everybody come with me, and I run out of the door, I guarantee you that probably like 5 or 6 people would jump up at the very minimum and run with me without even really thinking about why we're running, right? But I think this idea is that like, it's because like fear is a massive motivator, right? Like one of the things, even like, my daughter's room is not always like super clean, right? And so when we were having the fires, like my family had to be evacuated. The fire was really close to our house, right? And then after that, like we started having conversations. She asked me like, what are things that could start fires? Are there things in your house that could start fires? And I was like, one of the things is like making sure your room's clean, making sure there's not, iPhone and iPad chargers laying all over the place, that surge protectors, like power outlets are clear. And like that next day, she cleaned her room like really, really well, right? And like all her cables were neatly put away and things like that. I was like, oh, she's motivated by a fear of a fire starting in her room, right? And even though that example is something that's a very logical fear, it's still something that could add extra convincing to say, oh, here's why you should be doing this. And it helped persuade her to clean her room, right? And so I think that if we think about these ideas of where people can be motivated by emotion, a lot of times, like kind of you hear about that, like kind of tugging at heartstrings, right? Like making people feel a certain way. Think about maybe a charity that you might give to, right? Like I watch TV a lot of times, like late at night, and there'll be like that commercial where they show all the really sad dogs in the pound. I'm sure you guys have seen that commercial before, right? And it's got like the song that's really sad that Sarah McLachlan sings. And it's like, when I watch that commercial, I'm like, I want to rescue all of those dogs, right? Like I want to send all the money to save these puppies. And so like the idea is like, those commercials are created on purpose because people can be motivated by that emotion. And the last piece of it is this idea of logos. That people, it's easy to appeal to logic, right? That this idea of like, you should be able to agree with this because this is the logical conclusion. So a lot of times when we think about logos, we think about numbers. We think about people trying to persuade people with giving them evidence to something. That if we give like, here's some kind of concrete data, that becomes easy for people to be like, okay, I get this. I agree with you because you're showing me logic. And we can see extreme examples of like where Trevor Noah does that in his book, right? Like he kind of has these in-between chapters where like a lot of it is narrative, right? He's telling his story, but then there's also moments where he shows this was legislation. Here's an example. Here's what the language was of the Immorality Act, right? Here's practices that were going on and laying historical context. So logically, when you read his stories, you're like, okay, I get where he's coming from because he's giving us these in-between chapters where he's laying out what some of the historical context was. And then from there, it makes it a logical conclusion to be able to see how he was experiencing those things that he was experiencing. Any questions at all on this so far? So for this class, for English 1, like the big thing that I want us to take away are being able to identify these 3 things, right? Being able to identify rhetoric as a whole, but really kind of think about ethos, pathos, and logos, that we appeal to ethics, we appeal to emotion, and we appeal to logic. So let's look at a quick example or two. Let me just share this with you. All right, we'll talk about what these mean. All right, so I'm going to share, and I'm going to show the computer sound, and we'll take a look at this clip, and then you tell me what kind of rhetorical strategies are being used when we look at it.
President Trump is...
You guys were all able to hear that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, thumbs. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. All right, here we go.
recovering from the coronavirus, and so is America. Together, we rose to meet the challenge, protecting our seniors, getting them life-saving drugs in record time, sparing no expense. President Trump tackled the virus head-on, as leaders should.
I can't imagine that anybody could be doing more.
We'll get through this together. We'll live carefully, but not afraid.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Okay, so rhetorical strategy. What do we see happening? What's something that stood out to you in this video? You don't even have to name it, but what's standing out to you in this video?
It's using pathos because they're using as elderly citizens as vulnerable to the COVID.
Exactly. Good. Right. So we're seeing this idea of like really strong pathos happening in there, right? Like we're seeing elderly people, we're seeing that kind of thinking about that vulnerability. Good. Anything else stand out to people?
Well, I think they're using our emotions as well.
Good. How come?
Well, because you see the elderly, because they say that the virus usually attacks the older people. Look at it and it's just, you feel sorry.
Yeah, exactly. There's that piece where you feel sorry, right? Where you feel like compelled that like, I want to do something, right? I want to be able to help, or I want to, in this case, right? If we think about what the message is, or what we're kind of being sold is to make this vote if you want to be able to help this group, right? Absolutely. Anything else that stands out to you about this video?
Even the sound, like the
Yeah.
music in the background makes it
Absolutely.
They
sound
incorporate our president as a leader that was supposedly vulnerable because he got the virus, and he got rid of it or whatever, or was able to outstand it or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely, right? That's really good. So what we're seeing is we're seeing this idea of like everything, whether it's the music in the ad, whether it's the pictures they're showing, the elderly couple mentioning the fact or focusing on the fact that he had COVID, the picture they're choosing to use at the end, the footage they're using, everything in this video is intentional, right? That there is nothing that's happening in this clip that's not there absolutely on purpose, right? Like this is an example of really, strong examples of pathos being used throughout an ad, right? Because it's trying to bring out a lot of emotion in us. Let's look at another one. Let me share this again. And then we'll look at an example of it happening in text.
There is only one America. No Democratic rivers. No Republican mountains. Just this great land and all that's possible on it, with a fresh start. Cures we can find. Futures we can shape. Work to reward. Dignity to protect. There is so much we can do if we choose to take on problems and not each other, and choose a president who brings out our best. Joe Biden doesn't need everyone in this country to always agree. Just to agree we all love this country, and go from there.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
All right, what about that one? What's standing out in that clip to you?
Well, I see like he's trying to bring all of us together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What's an example of that you saw in the video of him trying to bring everyone together?
There were so many different there, different people, that's kind of people hugging, shaking hands, and with different cultures, and that's kind of what basically just to unite everybody.
Yeah, so there's a ton of example of diversity in that video, right? Like, and I think you also hit on something kind of interesting too, about like the idea like people are hugging and shaking hands, which is kind of one of those things that like I know a lot of people are missing right now, right? It's just like that close connection with each other, being able to like reach out and like, even there's times where like I have to kind of like, I was on a walk the other night and like I met a neighbor around the corner. There was like this kind of like, we shook hands and I was like, whoa. And after we shook, he's like, oh, I guess we shouldn't. And I was like, it didn't even dawn upon me. It's just like so normal to like, hey, how's it going? Nice to meet you, right? And it's like, and I think we're starved of that kind of like interaction with each other. So that's an interesting point. What else are people seeing in this? Maybe we want to start labeling this. Do we see ethos, pathos, or logos happening in this ad? Some ethical stuff, some emotional stuff, some logical stuff. Any ideas?
I think it's a mixture of ethos and pathos, but I can't really tell. It's
Good.
kind
How
of
come? I think absolutely. How come? Why do you see that?
well, because they're using different people, like bringing the community together as a sense, but then they're also trying to persuade. I don't know. It's just like
That's good. So if you're saying it brings showing different people, what kind of rhetorical appeal do you think that is? Is it appealing to ethics, emotion, both? What do you think?
Well, I think the emotion, because again, the type of music that's playing in the background, it's God, like we need to come together and, so that's just my opinion.
It's good. Yeah, absolutely. I think the music does a big part of it, especially that version of it, right? It's like kind of single, like emotional piano, right? Versus like big marching band playing that song or something like that. Good. Anything else? The very opening part, if we think about like the ethical piece of it, like in the very beginning, it says like there are no whatever it is, like Republican mountains or right. I mean, like, or no Democratic valleys or whatever the exact phrasing was. And it's like, what do you think that's trying to do in the beginning? Why do you think they mention it like the land itself is not Democratic nor Republican?
it's. I think it's trying to say, in a sense, that we are all as one as people.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. And I think that's an example of a use of ethos, right? Like a lot of times you'll hear the word ethos be used to describe, like, if I were to say, like, what is this person's ethos, or what is this company's ethos, or like identity, like an entity or a group can have a collective ethos, right? Like, and so what's starting to happen here is this ethos is that you can hear through the ad, like again and again and again, there's the use of plural pronouns. We, us, right? Like it's not me or I or you, it's all of us together, we together. And so that ethos is that like we're all together. Doesn't matter, what political party that you align with, doesn't matter what type of job you have. It's like it's all of us together. And if you know, like that's an example of being able to use that ethos, right? And so if we think about that, like a lot of times we hear maybe there's like, I don't know, maybe you have like a company that you really like, or maybe you have like a brand that you really support because like you believe in the work that the company does, right? Like I know like that company Tom's Shoes got really, really popular, right? Like years back when that brand came out. But right away, their ethos is that we give back. For every pair of these shoes you buy, we give a pair of these shoes away, right? And we see a lot of companies do versions of that. There's a brand of socks that I wear, and it's like for every pair of socks I buy, a pair of socks gets donated, right? And so like that's part of the company's ethos. That's part of that company's ethics, is that they believe in giving back or philanthropic support or whatnot. And so I think if we look at this example of this ad, the big thing that this ad wants to do, and they do it emotionally also, is get us to agree that we're all one together, that we all work together on something. I want to show you an example of some rhetoric in writing, because this is where we start thinking about how we can start doing this in our own writing, or how we can start to kind of like, more than anything else, like there's this idea of like a word gets salient, right? And when something is salient, it means that it's now easily to be able to see, right? Like, have you ever had that happen before, like where you lost something in your house and you can't find it, and then when you finally find it, you're like, oh, it was right there in front of me the whole time? Like, or maybe that's just me, right? Because I don't know, like I do that very often. I'm like, I can't find my car keys, or I can't find my AirPods, or whatever it is I can't find. And then when I finally find them, I was like, oh, they were sitting right there and I should have been able to see them the whole time. And it's like, once you see where something's at, then it's kind of impossible to unsee it, right? It's like, I should have been able to see this. That's because that thing became salient, right? A perfect example of saliency is like when you buy a car, for example. So like while like our last car that we bought is a white minivan, which is super cool life that we live, right? That's when I knew that like I've now become, you know, just kind of like a full-on dad mode, right? And so when we bought that car, like I never paid attention to minivans when I drove around. I never paid attention to them in parking lots. I never paid attention to white ones. It was just never something that was on my mind at all. But now when I come out of stores or when I go to parking lots, I'm like, man, everyone drives a white Honda Odyssey. Well, they always same number of people drove them before. It's just now I'm aware of those cars. So when I came out of Costco the other day and I was like, walk to a car, I'm like, oh, that's not my van. Walk to another one, I'm like, that one's not mine either, right? That's like, I feel like everyone's driving them. Well, it's not the case. It's just now I'm aware of them because I have one, right? And so like, that's this idea of like, when you become aware of something, then it's easier for that thing to pop out at you. And that's one of the things that's helpful about looking at rhetoric like this is as we become aware of it, then these rhetorical strategies can become more salient to us because now we've given them a name, right? And once we give them that name, then we can start to look at them and say, oh, I see it here, I see it there, I see it there. There's an example of an appeal to ethos. There's an example of an appeal to pathos or emotion, right? And so let's look at an example just a little bit in some writing here. So this is because one of the things that essay directions that we can focus on is focusing on housing. So this is an open letter that was written by Los Angeles's Mayor Garcetti. And the title of this open letter that he wrote is Rising to the Challenge and Helping Homeless Angelenos. So just based off of this picture alone, what kind of appeal do you see happening? And the title, just off of this picture, this title, what do we see?
Pathos.
Yeah, how come?
Because they're showing, you know, both the people's expressions as happy and smiling at each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then they incorporate the title as Rising to the Challenge, Helping
Mm-hmm.
Homeless. So
Mm-hmm.
in a sense, either he's helping someone that's homeless or they both are, or
Mm-hmm.
you know, the intention is.
Absolutely, right? That's really strong. Showing that intention is good. Anything else that stands out about this picture or the title? Keeping in mind that this is all on purpose. Now, when I say it's on purpose, I don't mean that I think it's insincere, right? I don't think maybe, you know, this could be, that's the thing about rhetoric. And that's where it's up to us when I talk about this idea of being a critical consumer, right? Like the ads that I showed you, this article that I'm showing you, it's not about me questioning or saying that you should feel this way or feel that way or believe this or believe that. And I'm not suggesting that I don't think this ad is sincere, but I am saying that this was all done on purpose. It could be done on purpose for something that you wholeheartedly believe in or that he wholeheartedly believes in, or it could be done on purpose as just a means to persuade people. So it's not about me saying that like, just because it's done on purpose, it's not sincere, but it's done on purpose, right? This picture was selected on purpose, right? The title, same thing, on purpose. And the same thing that we do with the examples, when we're writing, the examples we choose to use in our essay are purposeful, right? They're not just there by accident. They're there to do something, to prove a point, to help articulate an idea. So if we look at this picture, I mean, look at the way that he's dressed. Look at the fact that he's touching her, right? Like he's got his hand on her shoulder, right? Like he didn't go out there in like a 3-piece suit. He went out there in like, you know, a relatively casual outfit for a mayor, right? Even if we look at this idea, the title, Rising to the Challenge. If we're rising to the challenge, if one's rising to the challenge, is that an example of ethos, pathos, or logos? Is it ethics? Is it emotion? Is it logic? What do you think?
Ethics.
Yeah, right. It's ethical. Like, are you willing to do something? Are you willing to rise to the challenge? It's like, that's really questioning ethics. Like, are you going to help? Right.
Yeah.
And what about this idea of homeless Angelenos? Why do you think that's important that it didn't just say helping the homeless? And why does it say helping homeless Angelinos?
So it's generalizing you know, in Los Angeles, but it's not. I don't. At least I don't think their intent is to target the person on the photo as homeless. However,
Yeah, or that's good. Or the idea that like the people who are homeless are part of our community, right? They're
yeah,
all Angelinos, regardless if they're people who need help or the people who could help, right? That it's like these are members of our community. It's not just the homeless, it's homeless Angelinos, it's people who are part of us, right? So there's also that like kind of like ethical appeal there also, like you would help members of your community, right?
yeah.
So let's look at just this open. We're just going to look at a couple lines of this. So if we read through this beginning, let's see what's happening here. So he says, "Dear fellow Angelinos, when the great San Francisco earthquake struck in 1906, it quickly became a world disaster in California history. Overnight, more than 200,000 people became homeless. Now, the most recent statewide data shows that California has 129,972 homeless residents, making our current homelessness crisis the second worst disaster we've ever seen in the Golden State. 1 week ago, we received sobering news that LA's homeless crisis is getting worse. And now there are 36,000 homeless Angelinos in our city, a 16% increase over the last year. The work we've done together to keep the growth of LA's homeless population about to half the average jump seen in cities in California, but we must do better. And we must treat this problem like the humanitarian emergency that it is. That starts with me. As your mayor, I take full responsibility for our response to the crisis. And like everyone who has seen families in tents or spoken to a homeless veteran in need, I am both heartbroken and impatient. While we have housed more Angelinos than ever before in the city's history, it's not enough. We must respond like it's an earthquake and do more faster." So what's standing out about this just so far of anything that I read? It's not really wrong answers here. It's just what do you see him doing in the way that he's writing?
He's giving numbers of the homelessness, of how much it was increased, and now.
Good. Why do you think he
like
might
that.
be doing that? Why do you think he's giving those numbers?
So that he could see how bad the crisis is.
Absolutely, right? So that can kind of help with like logically we could say, man, if it's this many people, like there needs to be that kind of support. Absolutely. If we're seeing this kind of increase, maybe we need to do something, right? What else do we see happening here?
I think he's comparing it to the San Francisco earthquake in 1906.
Good. How come?
Well, if I'm correct, I mean, that was a huge, huge earthquake that, you know, destroyed a lot back then. So kind of saying 200,000 people, that's a lot. You know, I don't know.
No, you're 100% right. So what do you think appeal is? Like, why do you think, why create that comparison? Do you think he's doing it to bring out emotion? Is he doing it to bring out ethics? Is he doing it to bring out logic? Is it all three? What do you think? One
Well,
more
I
than
think
the other?
logic. Well, I mean, I think maybe emotion too, because a lot of people lost their lives back then. You know, like I said, to be homeless, I mean, it's, you know, it's devastating, you know, for people to not have a home. So yeah, I think emotion, you know, when you think about that, because I know when I see a homeless person on the street, my heart hurts for them because we don't know people's stories, you know, what can get there. I think emotion, it plays a lot on emotion.
Good. Yeah. So absolutely, we're seeing some pathos happen there, right? And we can even see that when he says, like at the end of that bold section, we must respond like it's an earthquake and do more faster, right? So it's like drawing that comparison and saying, here is one of the worst natural disasters, or the worst natural disaster that we had in our country's history, right? Our state's history, and then also here is this disaster that's happening now. And by creating that comparison, he's doing that with a lot of intent there, right? Like that we need to respond to these in the same exact way. Anything else that you see him doing here? Look at this sentence in here. What's standing out to you in this passage, this whole paragraph? As your mayor, I take full responsibility for response to this crisis. And like everyone who has seen families in tents or spoken to a homeless veteran in need, I am both heartbroken and impatient.
He's using a mixture of ethos and pathos.
Good. How come, Drew?
Because he's giving his emotion on how he feels about the crisis and the situation itself. So he's standing up for it and saying that he's going to take full responsibility and for the the future as to what's going to happen next.
Right. Good. And then you also said that he's doing some, so there's definitely that his ethos, right? Like, I'm to blame for this. I should be doing it. Like, I need to do more, right? Like, I take responsibility. What about some of the pathos stuff that's happening in here? Some of the emotional.
That he's bringing up the effect of homelessness, and that there's veterans that are in need, and they fought for our country, and it's a heartbreaking situation that in our world today that's a thing.
Absolutely. Right. That's a really great point that you're making there, right? Like, think about how less effective this passage would be if he would have just wrote, I take full responsibility of this crisis. And for anyone who has ever seen a person who is homeless, I feel both heartbroken and impatient. But once you say families living in tents or spoken to a homeless veteran in need, immediately it elicits that emotion. And it also makes you say, based on the emotion, like, ethically, we have to do something, right? To Drew's point, if this person's a veteran and they've fought for our country and essentially like fought for us as citizens, and now we're saying, but we're not willing to do anything for you, right? Like, that brings in this whole feeling of emotion, and also questions this idea of like, are we good people if we're not willing to do something? Same thing when we think about the emotion of the imagery of a family living in a tent, right? Like, for me, it starts bringing up emotions. I think about my own kids. I think about my own family. I think about how fortunate I am. I think about those kind of things. It's like, again, this paragraph is effective because of that point. Like I said, think about, like, everyone who has seen homeless people, I am both heartbroken and impatient. That does not do the same thing as just adding those two little examples. So here's why I think this is really important for us to think about this now as we're building our arguments. One of the things that I really stress is that idea of show me, right? Like, prove it to me. Think about that idea of like, you're making an argument, now show me. Your show me becomes so much incredibly stronger with specific detail. And also thinking about your intentional specific detail. Why this example, right? And when it comes to that intention, throwing out your analysis. Why did I choose this example? Why did I choose this passage from the reading? Why did I think about this experience that I'm writing about, and giving that analysis to your reader? So as we're writing, right, and as we're sharing our ideas with people and kind of building our arguments, the important thing to think about is that, like, your choices, the experiences that you write about, the quotes you use from a reading, the examples that you're developing, the analysis you're putting behind your idea, the title you give your essay, the hook you give your essay, all of these kind of things, you're doing them intentionally, right? Just like if you're having a conversation with a friend about, maybe something difficult or advice you might be giving something or whatever, you're choosing your words wisely, right? You're thinking about what your delivery is. And so I think that that's really, really important for you to keep in mind. And we're going to kind of keep on practicing this and labeling this as we see it, but to help you with thinking about the essays that you're going to be working on for this third essay. And then also as we move into the research project, and you're already doing this now, but really start thinking about why am I including these ideas? And if I'm creating an argument, if I'm essentially building this argument about, like we did with the previous one with bias, or in this case, we're going to be looking at like either you could pick between the topics of like language, family, or housing, and language will be the last piece that we look at next week. Like that, the examples that you're giving, the quotes you're giving from the book, the experiences you're giving from your lives, they're there intentionally, with the intention of building a more effective argument, right? With the intention of being able to create this purpose behind, here's what I want to prove to my reader, and here are the examples that I think will effectively prove that. Does anyone have any questions at all on any of the stuff that we talked about?
Yeah.
Sure.
So during our essays, I mean, is there a general rule of thumb of like how many we use of these persuasion tools, or it doesn't matter?
No, it doesn't really matter. And I think you're always using it, right? You're constantly using it. And I think that's one of those things that, like, you know, and we'll look at some different examples. I'll pull some different like examples from essays and share some of those just from a kind of across the class. But like, you know, there's moments when people think about like what they're doing in the hook of their essay, how they're pulling the reader into the paper, you know, talking about like, for example, even in the first essay, like a lot of people started their essays with this idea of like, you know, I've always had a difficult time in school, or being motivated in school always seemed hard for me, or things like that. Just that appeal in the very beginning, that kind of emotion and showing that vulnerability in the very beginning, like that's an example of doing it, right? And sometimes we're aware of it when we're doing it, and other times we're not. It's just kind of one of those things that like, I think it's because it's so common, and it's so much so the way that like that we appeal to people, the way that like, you know, like I said, even if it's something as simple as like my son wanted to go to McDonald's, and knowing that if he kind of like, hey, I was a good boy getting my shot, I'm like, you sure were, bud. Like, of course we went to McDonald's yesterday to get them food, right? Because like he was super excited, like he was good at the doctor, right? And it's like, that's just kind of one of those things that like we know, like that you could appeal to people that way. And if I think about the fact that like when I meet my classes for the first time, things that I talk to my students about, that, you know, I do it intentionally. And so I think that when we're doing that with writing, it's like, it's not necessarily like I have two appeals to ethics in this essay and one appeal to emotion, but it's that like really kind of just being aware that the examples that you're using, it's all intentional, right? It's all, I'm choosing this example because it illustrates this point well, and it makes my reader understand this from an emotional standpoint. And I think that's just kind of becoming aware of those ideas as you're writing. Any other questions at all?
No, that's it.
Okay, cool. So we're going to keep looking at this, right? And my goal was today is that this becomes something that starts to pop at you, right? Like I said, a class like English 4, we dive into this in a lot more depth, and we're going to continue to do it throughout this class and like look for some different examples and think about how we use it in our essay. But I just kind of want it now at this point to like be able to jump out at you, give it a name, and then we'll continue to build from there.